So we're so grateful that Richard had some time in his schedule and could come and elucidate us once again on the interesting story of Dale Morgan. I wanted to just point out to you, for those that don't know, Richard composed the descriptive bibliography of Dale Morgan called Eloquence from a Silent World way back when.
Ever ago.
When was this? 1990. So when did you start working on Morgan before that?
Let's see. 89 probably. So this has been a while.
35 years he's been working on the writings of Dale Morgan. So bibliography, he wrote 2 volumes of the collected works of Dale Morgan as part of the Kingdom of the West series published by Arthur Clarke Company. And now finally the biography of Dale Morgan. But outside of Dale Morgan, he also has contributed several important books, printing in the Deseret, Mormons, Economy, Politics, and Utah's Incunabula, 1849-1851. We actually have copies on sale here still for $9.99 if you're interested. He also did an excellent book with Greg Koford Books 2 years ago, the 1920 edition of the Book of Mormon, A Centennial Adventure in Latter-day Saint Book History. So don't let the title fool you. It's not just about the 1920 edition, but a lot of the intricacies of printing and publishing in the LDS book world of that time period. And I don't know, how many other book projects have you started now along these lines? 3 or 4 that I know of.
Well, there's that one. There's the paper book.
Right, I'm getting to
this
it.
one.
So
Oh,
he
yeah, you
did
got that one.
Reams in the Desert, Paper Making in Utah, 1849 to 1893.
That's the narrowest scholarly subject anybody has ever come up with.
I know a number of you were here for his BYU or presentation at the BYU Book Collecting Conference on this topic that later became a book. So we appreciate the work that Richard Saunders has done. There's about a half a dozen books here that I don't have as well. How many books in all have you published?
Several.
Remember?
I just...
About a dozen?
Yeah, well, maybe that.
Or so?
A lot of his family history, so you don't need that.
Well, anyway, so lots and lots of things. And we're here, of course, to listen to him talk about the biography. I wanted to thank the representatives from the University of Utah Press that are here. Glenda, the director. Hannah is our media and marketing. Jed Rogers here is the acquisitions editor. Is that your official title? So a great press that's publishing important works on Mormonism in their second wave for the last, what's it been now, 15 years or so?
Something like that.
So an incredible collection of work that they have published, and we appreciate them being here tonight and supporting this author. And I just wanted to tell you the next event that we have on the schedule is for this little volume from the University of Illinois Press on Joseph White Musser, Mormon Fundamentalist. That's coming up on March 12th. If you're able to come, Christina Rossetti will be up to speak and sign copies of that. And then that's the only thing we have on the books. We got a couple of things coming later in the spring that we'll hopefully have events for, but that's the next one. And just a reminder, if you'll turn off your phones so that we don't have interruptions to Richard's presentation tonight. These events will be recorded, and we'll later post that video on YouTube and on our website so that you can view it again or tell people about it so they can watch it. And I know we have at least 3 or 4 other presentations Richard has done over the years. So if you need a good
you need a fix, yeah.
fix of Richard Saunders, available on YouTube. Any questions, I guess? Without further ado, then we'll turn the time over to Richard, and wherever you're comfortable, but the camera's there, so
okay.
whatever.
That'll keep me in one place.
Okay.
Just because I have to mention that Dale Morgan has a connection to Joseph Musser. Musser's daughter was Morgan's secretary, working for the Writers Project back in the early 1940s.
Wow.
So there's a bit of esoterica for you. Got to start off with, Phil, number one, thank you for coming. I appreciate it. I love talking about Morgan. I'm loving going to not have to talk about Morgan at some point. I will go on to another project. But this is fun to do right now. Let me just start off with a quote from Bernard DeVoto that DeVoto writes to Morgan in 1943. He says, "Permit me to hazard a guess that you are a spoiled sociologist. At least it appears to me that when you have found an environmental explanation of something, you are content, you feel you have settled matters, and depart about some new and proper business, whistling in the carefree consciousness of a job well done." Okay? When we look at Dale Morgan, Morgan is I think a critically underappreciated character in a very significant transitional time. He came to history here in Salt Lake City. He started working for the Historical Records Survey. Grew up just a few blocks down this direction over on Hollywood Avenue, off of 21st, well actually this way, off of 21st South. And grew up in a Salt Lake City that was also populated by a character by the name of Wallace Stegner, who he later knew and knew very, very well. But roughly at the same time. Stegner was a little bit older than Morgan, but not by much. The men both appreciated each other tremendously, had a great respect for each other's work. I said in the book that they had a relationship that could be picked up at the drop of a stamp. And literally that was the case for them. But Morgan came to history kind of through a back ways. He had planned to be an advertising executive. That's what he wanted to do, is write advertising. Tried very hard to get into the business, and actually had a pair of interviews with an advertising company in Salt Lake City, Gillum's Advertising, which you may recognize as the company that was run and managed by Marion Nelson. As nearly as I can tell, Morgan, when he went in 1939 to interview the second time at Gillum's Advertising, probably was shown through the building, introduced, and taken back to his father's office by a very young Russell M. Nelson, although obviously not something that President Nelson remembers right off. He was never successful in advertising, mostly because he did not hear. He was completely, totally deaf, nerve deafened from a bout with probably bacterial meningitis at the age of 14, the summer of 1929. And he lost his hearing over the course of probably about a week, nearly as we can tell. The book goes into some more details and some epidemiology and how that probably happened. I did not understand, and for a very long time I didn't figure out how that may have happened until we had the very substantial misfortune of losing a student to bacterial meningitis in the early 2000s when I was working in Tennessee. And it can go very, very quickly, and if you don't catch it, it can be fatal. Morgan was one of the comparatively few cases of bacterial, what I think was bacterial meningitis. There was never anything that was authoritative done, other than he had lost his hearing. But it was an obvious blow to a young man just hitting puberty and who was instantly cut off from everything that he had known. And when you don't hear, people tend to forget you're around, and that's very much what happened to Morgan. The other side of it was he was so incredibly self-conscious about his new malady that he actively withdrew and began pushing people away so that he didn't have to interact and didn't feel the fool. It's a challenging story and a difficult story. Very unlikely that he would have had very many deafened peers as a teen, even in the state, simply because it was so unusual to lose one's hearing in that fashion, and especially totally and completely. Morgan made his career working in history, or was introduced to history, 1938, in August of 1938, when he took on a job working for the Historical Records Survey, which was a WPA-era relief project. He was as nearly as I can tell, a non-relief subject. He was a qualified professional, so he was given a non-relief position as the editor, and within a very, very short time had decided that he needed to, or that there was room for some serious history about the West and about Utah. Now, he wasn't thinking of Latter-day Saints at that point. He was thinking of the state. And because of that, he eventually, over the course of a couple of years, he spent a year and a half, 2 years with the state for the Historical Records Survey, then made the jump to the Writers Project as its director at age 25, and had an office staff of about 60 people, depending on roughly when it was. So for a young man, he was feeling his oats quite a bit. The one major thing that he did, especially for the WPA period, was his book, The State of Deseret, which people, I'm sure, has anybody not seen that one? As nearly as I can tell, if we look at scholarly apparatus, notes and footnotes and careful documentation, if we look at that book and that standard across what was being published at the time, Dale Morgan's book, The State of Deseret, which was published in the Quarterly, in the Utah Historical Quarterly, would have a good basis to argue that it's the first modern study of Utah, and certainly of the Latter-day Saints. It's the first one to genuinely have a full scope of footnotes that was documented, that was told from the documentation and not dealt with from the perspective of just testimony or just rendition of the time. So I think it's a fairly significant piece. I didn't emphasize it maybe as much as could have been done, but you know, you have to make choices in a book like this. I think it's significant, however, that within a very short amount of time, Morgan and his boss at the time, who was Maurice Howe, who was from Ogden, Maurice Howe recognized in Morgan that he was an exceptionally gifted person when it came to memory. Dale's brother, younger brother Jim, once upon a time, Jim lived down the street from me when we lived in Bountiful, and that's really how I kind of came to this whole process. Jim one time told me that Dale would come to family events and would invariably bring 2 or 3 books with him. Now this is one of his favorite things, was his family, but there was always a time where he wasn't communicating very much with anybody, and so he would kind of sit in a corner and would go through a book at about that speed all evening, and he had pretty darn close to total recall for what he read. And it wasn't complete, but it was remarkable. If he grabbed something in mind, he could usually walk back to it at some point, whether it was in his notes or whether it was in his very heavily marked up library. So Morgan's ability to just absorb was categorically remarkable. And I think it was possibly a compensation that may have happened because he had been deafened. I don't know that he natively would have done that. He was much more interested in fiction before losing his hearing. He attempted writing fiction in college and did a number of things through at the U when he was a college student there. But once he had moved into the Historical Records Survey, once he'd gone with the Writers Project, he basically gave up fiction except as recreational reading, and thereafter simply became a consumer, just literally drinking in everything that he could find on the West. And when you think about it, in the 1930s and 40s, there weren't all that many secondary materials out there. So he was kind of, not on the cutting edge, but he was early on with the idea of the West as a field of study and writing as well. Howe introduced him, Maurice Howe introduced him to the former WPA National Personnel Director, who was also a Utahn. Anybody familiar with Nels Anderson, Desert Saints? Desert Saints had been started when he had been a student down at Dixie, where he knew and understood Juanita Brooks. He did his degree work at BYU and then eventually went to the University of Chicago for a PhD. Morgan became, because Howe introduced, a little spooky there for just a second. Howe introduced him to Anderson, Nels Anderson. That's the point at which Anderson became very interested in seeing his own work go forward. So he had really wanted to do something about the Latter-day Saints, didn't really quite know what to do, and talked to Morgan. Morgan kind of pushed him along the process, and Anderson was beginning to write. And then Morgan went through Desert Saints at least a couple of times, fixing errors and filling out notes and doing things like that. And because of that, Anderson took hold of this young man and said, "You have done work, especially with the state of Deseret. You've done work that most PhDs would be thrilled to do." Morgan thought that was a high compliment, and it probably was. It was intended to be. Anderson was the one who connected him with another character, or excuse me, he and Morgan and Wallace Stegner reconnected actually kind of accidentally. Stegner was the faculty advisor for the student newspaper, the Daily Universe at the U, for which Morgan was a fairly low character as a copy editor, proofreader of sorts for that. And later, when Stegner was working on Mormon Country, the book that became Mormon Country, he came back and decided he would like to use the Writer's Project files, which were publicly available at the time. And that's where the men reconnected. And they never really disconnected through the rest of their lives. Morgan read and corrected the proofs for Mormon Country, and the editor from Duell, Sloan and Pierce, who had sent Morgan the proofs, said that Stegner had told him that sending these proofs to Morgan for correction was the best insulation he knew for making boneheaded mistakes in the book, which was really quite a remarkable compliment for somebody who only had a college education and had never really formally trained in history at all. So he was really an autodidact in the whole process of that. Morgan eventually corrected not only the proofs for that, but also for Beyond the 100th Meridian, which he thought, in his opinion, was one of the 3 books that Morgan himself thought he would like to have written. If you haven't read that one, that's an excellent read about the nature of John Wesley Powell and the Powell expeditions and the rise of science in the federal government. Morgan eventually left things. Stegner went off from university here to eventually to Stanford, where he made his long career. And Morgan took off and went to Washington, D.C., where he worked as a low-level functionary in a federal government office, the Office of Price Administration. And unfortunately, that gig put him in the 2 most hated federal agencies of the 1940s, the WPA and the Office of Price Administration. And for that reason, he had a very hard time getting seriously considered for work thereafter, which was unfortunate because he was enormously capable, tremendously competent individual. But he had 2 black marks against him, at least in the federal service. And so after working for the OPA, though he went back again to Washington, D.C. in 1950 and 1949 and tried to make it again in federal government, he could never manage it. And there's a long story that's involved with how that happened and why that may have happened as well. However, let me go back to Stegner, because Stegner paid him a compliment in 1944 that's probably worth quoting directly. Morgan in 44 at that point was working on a John Fremont biography intended to be middle grades or high school reading, not necessarily a scholarly biography. And Stegner said, "That is good news about your Fremont job and the beginnings of the history." He was talking about the Mormon history, and I'll talk about that in just a second. "Boy, how I shall pore over that in search of a miscued date or a faulty reference." Stegner says, "Benny DeVoto and I are determined, sooner or later, to pool our resources and send you at least one page of errata on one of your books. That's pretty high testament to how Stegner thought of Morgan. A couple of years later, Bernard DeVoto wrote Morgan directly after Morgan had corrected not only Oberlin in 1846, 1846 Year of Decision, but also a couple of other Stegner's works, or of DeVoto's works. And DeVoto says, there are ways in which it's depressing to get a letter from you. You know so much and are careful and accurate by nature, and you progress by intelligent sequences. Now, DeVoto was a major character and a major thinker in American letters. And Morgan was not necessarily superior to him, but he was certainly an equal. And DeVoto used Morgan to bounce ideas off of. In fact, Morgan connected a number of people who later became known, or was later identified as Mormondom's lost generation. So when we think about Juanita Brooks, you know, she is kind of the doyen of regional history for for Utah. But Morgan is the one who connected her and Fawn Brodie, and connected Fawn Brodie and Bernard DeVoto, and connected DeVoto and Stegner knew each other already. But Morgan kind of sat near the epicenter, keeping things going between all of them at some point. He was the common link between all five of them. Gary Topping's really wonderful book on that Oklahoma published 15 years ago, 20 years ago. About that, isn't it? 20, 25? Maybe I'm getting really old. Is a wonderful critique of that whole generation of Utah writers who really had, in their own individual ways, major influences on the history of the West and of Mormondom. Morgan didn't do everything by himself, like no author ever does, but he was a touchstone character for all of them at different stages. For instance, 1937, Juanita Brooks locates a couple of first-hand accounts of the Mountain Meadows Massacre, and she wants to do something with them. And her initial idea is to put together an article, which she'd already published the waters in. And so she was thinking about in terms of an article, and so she connects, after she had connected with Morgan in about 1939, 1940. Morgan, they found out that they were both working on the same thing. Dale immediately packages up all of his notes on the Mountain Meadows Massacre and sends them to Juanita and says, you're going to need this. And thereafter, he basically didn't write anything much. He just let Juanita Brooks do it. She went off and at his suggestion, decided, no, you really have more than just an article here. You've got to do something substantive. And more than that, you have to do something that's not only substantive, but can hold criticism, so that there's nobody from the outside that can say that you didn't know what you were talking about. And when we look at the Mountain Meadows Massacre, if you look carefully at her works, she really doesn't use footnotes except in that one work. And the reason she doesn't, because Morgan had said you have to have them there. The only other one of her works that has footnotes is the transcription in the published edition of the 2-volume published edition of Hosea Stout's journal. And if you look carefully, you'll notice that most of those notes are explanatory, they're not documentary. So really the only work that Juanita produces that meets the standard that we would look at as scholarship is her very first work, which Morgan helped her hand carry through the whole process. Matter of fact, it was Morgan who suggests and approaches first Wally Stegner and then Stanford University Press as a publisher, and that's who eventually takes the book. He does the same thing a little bit later, actually a little bit earlier, with another writer who contacts him in Washington, D.C., and a woman named Fawn Brodie said, I've had 2 people in the last fortnight say that I need to talk to you. And the 2 of them became very fast friends very quickly. And Morgan did the same thing. I'm actually working, one of my next projects is a study that continues the 1920 Book of Mormon book that talks about the No Man Knows My History as a representation of the technological change that happens in American printing between World War II and her death and the move to offset lithography, which is tremendously boring unless you're me. But I think it'll be fun because in the process she goes back and edits and supplements her work from printing to printing in Knopf's hands. And again, Morgan is the one who read through her manuscript completely twice, gave her very, very detailed criticisms and helped turn that book, by her own account, from being a polemic, one more Joseph Smith polemic, into a serious work of scholarship that, in my opinion, is probably the single most influential book of Latter-day Saint history of the 20th century. Probably the most significant book of history of the 20th century. So, he's a fascinating character. From Washington, D.C., he comes, takes a job at the Bancroft, a temporary job working a split appointment between both the Navajo tribe working for a lawsuit, the interminable lawsuit with the Hopi, and a number of other related lawsuits, and then a partial appointment as a part-time appointment as the editor for the Bancroft Library. And I just this last December, unfortunately, after the book came out, I found an entire box that I had not seen before that documents what happened after Jedediah Smith and the opening of the West. And even as early as 1954, Morgan is starting to talk about a second edition and the revisions that were there. And he starts listing things that he would change as we go through it. So at some point, somebody's going to have to do a second edition of that book, if Nebraska ever lets it go. Let me think, what else we want to talk about? Morgan was in on the ground level with the founding of the Western Historical Association, WHA, and was an active member of WHA. Interestingly enough, he didn't really trust the Latter-day Saint version of that. He didn't ever get interested in Mormon History Association meetings, and so in some respect left the Latter-day Saints to the academics that were starting to come up at the same time he was already writing. People like Leonard Arrington. In fact, there's a wonderful letter from Leonard to Dale saying, "Gee, Mr. Morgan, I wish I knew enough to call you Dale." And Dale just let that hang. He was content to be Mr. Morgan. Now, they eventually warmed up and became quite good friends. But Dale also wrote Leonard one of the most, I think, incisive letters about the nature and philosophy of history among the Latter-day Saints that I think has been expressed so far. And he said basically that, look, it's not the historian's job to not be confrontational. It's to tell the story as fairly and as accurately and render a decision at the end. Part of the challenge with Morgan and the way that he approached things is that he very much felt that if you lined up enough facts, the story would reveal itself. And to some extent, don't hold me to this in an absolute sense, but in some ways, he forgot that the central part of history is the historian. And that every historian writes for present writers, or present readers, rather than those in the past, or in terms of those in the past, right? Dead people don't buy books. So you have to have current readers, and that's why history makes sense in the here and now. As a result, lining up all the facts you want will certainly help. It will help with documentation. But ultimately, the historian has to bring something of themselves and their own ideas to the subject to create from those facts something that is meaningful in the present. And I think that he probably was getting there as a historian, and he probably understood more than I'm giving him credit for there. But he was still very much convinced that facts would tell the story. And especially facts in Latter-day Saint history would tell the story. And Western history would tell the story. That's one of the reasons why he became someone who is very well connected to the generation that would found the Oregon California Trails Association, for instance. He was probably one of the last characters who really could bridge both organizations, both heritage organizations and the scholars. And scholars knew him and respected him, except in Utah. They didn't like him in Utah, partly because he wasn't of the proper vintage or the proper credential. Leland Creer, who was the department chair at the U, called Dale a dilettante to history, which really got some ire of a number of other historians who heard that and didn't think much of Creer in the process. The challenge that Dale faced, though, was the same one that faced many writers of the period, and that is by the late 1960s and the early 1970s, Morgan's brand of history was beginning to, I'll say, fall out of favor, but was beginning to lessen in its significance and in its importance, as new ways of looking at history really took over academia, and academia took over history. Ian Tyrrell, who's a historian that has written about basically the historiography and the historiology of the mid-century, points out that generally, not just in Utah, not just in Mormons, but generally, American historians tended to retreat inward as academia exploded in the 1960s to feed the baby boom generation and to the post-war generation and then the baby boom. And as a result, they began writing for themselves rather than for common readers like you and I. And because of that, the nature of history began to shift, and credentials became more important. That's a post-war generational thing as well. But credentials became more important. The idea of writing for as part of a conversation with other historians in reaction to what they had said became much more important. So the writing that Morgan was very capable of doing and was interested in doing simply became less read, less marketable, became more collectible and less readable. And that was, I think, another one of the big changes that happened during his lifetime. And the book has got a couple of short chapters in there that kind of summarize very quickly my interest as somebody who dabbles with book history and print history, to explain why that made a difference and what that meant in terms of the Latter-day Saints, and especially in terms of the American West. You can see, in fact, in the cases in here and a couple of them here, the idea of hyper-moderns, collectible versions of fairly standard works that became kind of the step beyond the fine press as the major presses began trying to find something to capture the interest in the specialty market that Morgan had written for a long time. I want to I'm going to kind of cut a little bit this short because I want lots of questions because it's easier to talk about it that way. I want to wind up with what Juanita Brooks wrote to Dale, almost the last letter that he received, at least it's the last among his papers. Pardon me. As she was talking to him and finally, let me back up. Morgan was diagnosed in late 1970 with terminal colorectal cancer that had metastasized, is that right? Metastasized to his liver. And so he had a very short time between his diagnosis and his eventual passing. And that seized up everything. He had been awarded a second Guggenheim Fellowship for a one-volume history of the North American fur trade. It was the one book that he wanted to go back to that would be grand scope, the way that Jedediah Smith in the Opening of the West had been for a little narrower subject. He wanted to literally do the entire North American fur trade, and especially not just in the mountains, but in marketing furs in the United States and in Europe as they were marketed out of there. When he was diagnosed, if you want, his career effectively ended on November 19th of just before his 56th birthday, as he got his diagnosis of terminal cancer. And he just dropped absolutely everything. He became completely focused on his own health, and it didn't have much to carry him forward. He passed away in the last day or the second to last day of March 1971 at the very young age of 56. I'll tell you, I had a very hard 56th birthday when I started realizing that, gee, I was now the same age as Dale Morgan when he died. And my biography at that point wasn't finished. Anyway, backing up a little bit, Juanita Brooks wrote him a letter, her last letter to him, that said, "We are all so indebted to you, Dale. Your work outweighs that of all the others combined." Now, who's he talking about, the others? She's talking about other Utah historians, those of his generation at the time. "Historians and sham historians all put together cannot match your contribution. I myself owe so much to your guidance, though I can hardly claim to be an historian. You were right when you said my area is folklore." So that was Juanita's take on Dale's take on Juanita, and that's the way he characterized her work. I'd rather answer questions at this point. I've given you kind of a very brief overview. He worked for a very long time for the Bancroft Library down in Berkeley, California, and that really drew him away from the Latter-day Saints and from the Intermountain West toward California history. But I'd rather answer your questions because I probably know more about Morgan than I can just tell you. So it's nice to have a prompt or two as we go forward. So, who wants to be the first one?
I always wondered about the Mormon bibliography manuscript. In 1970, how did that manuscript compare to the one that was finally published in 1978? And why did Flake decide not to include Morgan's name as an author?
Okay, let me give you a very short version of that. Dale's introduction is in the front of that book.
Yeah.
So he tells his own story in there. The short version is Morgan had begun compiling slips. Basically, we're all old enough. We remember card catalogs, right? Okay. I say that to my students. They go, huh? But he was beginning to handwrite, and he ended up with about 8 or 10 boxes of filed slips alphabetically with his notes. Some of them were catalog cards, some of them were paging slips, some of them were, it was a real kind of mare's nest of transcription. Those eventually he allowed the State Historical Society here in Salt Lake to take all of his cards and type out a manual catalog that was the precursor to the Flake bibliography. So there were about 6,000 works there, I think, roughly given the stuff that he had. That became really an invaluable resource to the State Historical Society. However, in the 1960s, libraries, institutions tended to publish catalogs because that was the only way you could disseminate a catalog across a large area was to publish it. He helped to do the manuscripts catalog, for instance, at Bancroft, and helped with at least 2 of the 3 volumes. The 3rd volume was never finished. But that catalog, toward the end of his life, 1964, 65, Everett Cooley, when he goes from the State Historical Society to the U, takes with him an idea that, look, we have got to get this out of the Historical Society and into the hands of scholars. And so there was the state librarians literally put together a board to publish that, to figure out how to get that published. It wasn't really new, but it was the newer University of Utah Press agreed to publish it under a subvention with the rest of the libraries involved in its production and support. And Chad Flake from BYU was the one that was offered and agreed to take it on. And so Flake took Dale's, they got a typescript first, and then they started shopping it around. He would take this thing with him, and he'd go to California, and he would go to various places and check everything manually. What happened was that Chad found there was an awful lot of stuff that even Morgan missed or that other librarians had missed that had never been recorded. And so that just simply got added to it. So it almost doubled in size from what Morgan had started with. So lots of broadsides, lots of things like that had never been included or had been discovered after Morgan was working. So when it all got put together, at the very end, 1968 I think was the first time Ev Cooley funded Dale's travel to Salt Lake, and he sat down with Chad in 3 or 4 sessions, and Dale would go through and mark and had annotated heavily where, you know, what needed to happen. And he actually was the one who laid out for Chad how he thought the book should be organized and how it should work. And then he contributed a foreword to it as well. What I found remarkable was, in fact, I went about, what, 1998, 1999, I went down to Chad's office and I said, okay, Chad, I want to see your manuscript. And so he brought it out. He still had it, still has it. And it had actually gone into type years before it was produced, but they wanted to check and then double check everything and fill out the census on a number of things as well. So it just took a long time to go through the process. It could have been published 10 years earlier, and it would have had to go into a second edition very, very quickly. But Chad said that he and Dale and Ev Cooley sat around a table, and Dale had made notes about things, and every once in a while he would go through and he'd say, okay, now, if you go to this edition, and I don't think it's the 6th, I think it's the 7th edition, I think if you look at the page count, you'll find it's this and not what you've got recorded. And I asked him, I said, Chad, you have got to be kidding me. I said, how often did he do it? He says, not very often. I said, how many times was he wrong? He said, not once. So Morgan carried around in his head a remarkable amount of material. But the flake bibliography that we have is genuinely Chad's work. So Dale started it off. It was turned into a catalog in the sense of a card catalog by the State Historical Society staff and checked from their own records. But it was really Chad who did the work that made that book into what it is, that catalog into what it is. So it went from 6,000 to about 10,000 items in that first edition, and then of course the supplements that were done after that. That answer the question?
Yeah, I guess, yeah. It just seems, I guess they included Morgan's introduction, and when you read the introduction, it sounds like he's introducing his work.
Well, he was.
But then it turns out to be Blake's work.
Yeah, he was. And
because he died, I guess, before it was finished.
oh yeah, long time.
Yeah.
You know, it was published in
10 years.
78. Dale died in 71.
Yeah.
So and by then, Chad had already gone deeply into the project, and Dale was perfectly happy with that. He was perfectly happy with it. Although Ev Cooley was very pointed, that says we know this is your bibliography. But Dale didn't care. He was happy to have it out under Chad's name, and Chad did a great job.
Oh, so Morgan agreed to have just Chad's name on it.
I don't know if he agreed to it, but he wasn't after the notice. Dale also was a little reticent, partly because of the challenges that had happened in Utah in the 1940s over history. And it wasn't just with the Latter-day Saints. This was really the shift in history nationally. This happened in Louisiana, and it happened in Massachusetts, and it happened in California and other places where, you know, the generation that had founded the West and their children was basically gone, and now you had people who were anxiously ready to gild the lilies. Okay, they were ready to trumpet the pioneers and to do all those kind of things. If you're interested, I actually go into this in some detail in the Juanita Brooks lecture that I did in 2019. Go onto YouTube for that. And I talk a little bit more about Juanita and Dale and how that fits, and then give you some illustrations on that shift and why it happened in the way that it happened. There's a few things that into the book that I didn't get to put into it, because every book has to have a page count, right? You don't get 6 volumes. But there is a story to be told, I think, about the very painful evolution of historiology within the church historian's office, and how it was dragged kicking and screaming out of the 19th century, and made a shift into the 20th century, and made it to a point where we literally had to wait for people to die before the generation could really be adopted in the way that I think it needed to go. And Dale wasn't the only one who said that the church historian's office needs to shift. Prior to his comment, if you look at Darrell Chase's dissertation or thesis, I guess, on Sidney Rigdon, he says exactly the same thing, that things need to happen. In the beginning of what's Stegner's book on the Overland Trail? What's the title?
Mormon Trail.
Is it Mormon Trail?
Gathering of Zion?
Gathering to Zion,
Oh,
that's the
yeah,
one.
yeah.
That's the. In the beginning, Devoto writes a foreword, and he says basically, look, I don't trust anything that comes from a Latter-day Saint source unless I can see the manuscript. I want to see the original manuscript, because there's so much 19th century fluff that gets padded into a lot of things. It wasn't just the Latter-day Saints who did that. Everybody had a heritage organization. I mean, Daughters of the American Revolution, right? Sons, the Daughters of the Confederacy. I mean, I lived in Tennessee with that bone over my shoulder. I have good friends who are unreconstructed Confederates. They remember the kind of history they want to remember. That's part of the challenge that Morgan was trying to take on, at least in a Latter-day Saint context within Utah. But he found the similar, won't say the same, he found similar sentiments among, is it John Zond? I think that's right, who was a Strang member. There were people among the RLDS factors who did the same thing. And there's a quote in there in the book about Morgan saying, you know, if I please one group, then somebody else gets mad at me. If I please them, then there's a third who takes issue with me. So you can't deal with history on a believable scale. You can't use history as a substitute for faith, is basically what he was saying. And that faith sometimes doesn't fit into history in the way that we think it might. So he struggled with it partly because during the 1940s, in a large sense, Mormonism and the Latter-day Saints movement was really wrestling with some fundamental existential issues on its own, which is probably an overused word, I've been told. But it's very true. We were trying to figure out, what does history mean to us now when our pioneers are gone? So, what else?
What was the deal with Morgan and Madeline McCune?
Oh, I have to go home tonight. Okay. I'll try to tell this one shortly. It won't be short, but I'll try to tell it shortly. Madeline McCown or McCune, and I've never heard either way how to pronounce her name. I have said it McCown because I think that's the way that she pronounced it. Madeline was from northern Utah. She met and married Jarvis Thurston before meeting Dale. And Dale was, the year after they married, she was a fellow at the Bread Loaf Writers Conference back east. Very prestigious, still to this day, a very prestigious writers retreat. And she was bright and very insightful, but also a hypochondriac. At least I think she was a hypochondriac. And that was, anyway, she lived a very interesting life. She and Dale was captivated by her partly because she had a connection to letters with a capital L, Bell-Let, that he lacked and really kind of aspired to. But she was also a very good critic, or at least he thought she was a very good critic. And they, because of the time, had to rely, and because he was deaf too, relied a lot on typewritten letters back and forth between each other, sometimes multiple times a week, sometimes they'd go for a while before they'd talk. But that became his voice and her voice back and forth across the distance. And he and Jarvis had started off playing chess together in the Ogden Chess Club, and then at the U first, at the U as a writer, and then ended up playing chess together. But they became very much a threesome. They were very close socially. And McCown, I think she took advantage of Dale's very real commitment to his friends. Not wittingly initially, I think it just kind of evolved into that over time. But over the years, she was a bit like my mother. She was never happy where she was. She was always dealing with some traumatic health issue. And she struggled a lot at both wanting stability and needing a challenge. Part of the challenge with telling that story is that she self-censored their relationship. In 1974, when Ev Cooley finally managed to get her to deed her material, her own archive of material, to the University of Utah, she first went through it and either discarded a letter or tore out the parts that weren't offensive or that didn't paint her in a very good light. There has been some interesting comments about, or supposition about, were they intimately involved? My sense is probably not. She held Dale off repeatedly as a romantic connection, even though he really wanted to pick up the pieces after her divorce from Jarvis Thurston. It was very clear from the correspondence that we have that it was like, no, nope, not a chance. And because of that, he was still very loyal to her, kind of hoping for a long time. But eventually, over time, she became more and more needy and less dependable on her own resources. Her second husband, Tom McCown, and her picked up a mutual friend, and the three of them became an item. At least he had a live-in boarder, and there was nothing inappropriate in that relationship. It's just that they were a threesome because they weren't making enough money to afford a house in California at the time. But Madeline was Dale early in his life, in the early 1940s, made her his executor and gave her, I think, the claim to his life insurance policy that he had taken out. After Dale kind of pushed her off to one side, he changed the beneficiary of his life insurance policy, and after his death, Ev Cooley told me that he thought that Madeline was expecting a settlement out of that life insurance, and when she didn't get it, that kind of complicated matters for her, and so she, Ev told me that she claimed to have done a lot more for Morgan than the documents suggest that she could have done. But it's a strange relationship. She wrote to him frequently, complained frequently. He was morose a good deal of the time in her direction, looking for the emotional intimacy that I think that he felt he lacked in human relationships. And it just was an unfortunate situation. Had he been hearing, I think things could have been much different, but they didn't turn out to be.
Are you saying that she helped him with his writing?
She claimed that she had fed him some of his ideas, but she also claimed the same thing about her first husband, Jarvis, and I know that's not the case.
Oh.
And I'm 100% certain that she didn't really contribute much in the way of what Morgan actually finished. But she claimed after his death that she had done a lot more than she probably actually did do. She never finished her own Brigham Young biography. Craig Foster did a really pretty good job analyzing that. I think he made a couple of interpretational errors, but you know, that's his choice, and they're supportable. So I don't know that there was anything. There was nothing inappropriate there, but it was a very weird relationship. Let me just put it that way. That's probably the easiest way to do it. Anything else? Come on, ask me some hard ones.
Tell us about his Palmyra work. How did he get into the Palmyra story? And tell us about what he did with Fawn Brodie in that story. How did he become an expert? Because he was very early in some of his understanding that.
He was very well. You remember he was somebody who in the early 1940s had tumbled to this idea of contemporary documentation, and even historians of the period weren't doing that much original primary work. That didn't come till the 1950s and later, with the real rise of academic history. And so one of the things that he did when he moved to Washington D.C. in 1949 was that he started going through initially Niles' Weekly Register, which was basically the YouTube feed, you know, for the United States. It would come out 12 times a year, was monthly, and it would basically digest everything that was going on from newspapers across the country. And unfortunately, because we have so few comparative newspapers compared to what was actually published, Niles and Niles' content became some of the only records we have of really early Latter-day Saint activity and Western activity and lots of other things as well. Morgan then branched out and he said, well, if we can find it in Niles, then it's got to be in some of these other files. And at that point, the National Archives was beginning their massive newspaper filming projects. So he had access to actual print files of newspapers, and he literally went through them page by page. Decided initially to look for Latter-day Saint stuff, and then decided, well, I'm doing fur trades too, so I'll do the fur trade as well. So he extracted everything, literally everything he could find in every newspaper of the period. He was convinced that the first vision could not have happened in 1820. Based on the fact that there's no revivals mentioned in any 1820 newspapers. And he's right. He's dead right. It took me a while to figure out that that's not, you know, Joseph Smith says he has his first vision early in the spring of 1820. Well, if you're going to revivals, you're probably not doing it while there's still snow on the ground in New York. So the period that he should have been looking at was 1819 and 1818, and that's where you find the revivals. He didn't find those because he didn't look far enough. He simply started with 1820 and worked forward with that. But he was one of the first, not the only one. He certainly wasn't the only person to do it. But he was one of the earliest people to go back to contemporary documentation and say, what does it say? Now there was another group of, Fawn Brodie was another one who did that as well, and partly because Morgan suggested that she needed to do that. He says that in they meet in 1843, after she has the fellowship, but before she's really embarked on the writing process. And when she's pregnant with Dick, her oldest son, she embarks on a week train travel around the United States, looking at original documentation that she hadn't had access to before, and that changes her book. That changes her whole approach to the book, or part of what changes her approach to the book. Morgan eventually made three carbons of his transcriptions of what he called the Mormons in the Far West, which were these newspaper transcripts, and they became part of his personal financing. He sold one set to Yale, he sold one set to the Huntington Library, he sold one set to the State Historical Society, which is still here, and he kept a set for himself, one of those carbons for himself. And for a very long time, that was the best record of both the Latter-day Saints in contemporary newspapers and the best first-hand documentation of things like the Santa Fe Trail and the Missouri Fur Company and the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. Stuff that you would never find today. And interestingly enough, a lot of those newspapers that he had taken a look at, we can't find them now. They're gone. So they were either microfilmed or he had access to copies that we just don't have now. And some of the newspapers didn't have an awful lot, and some of them were full. There's more Mormon material than there is fur trade material in it, just because of the context of the time. Did that answer your question? Anything else?
Will you
What else,
tell
Chris?
us about your upcoming projects?
Oh, I'd have to admit to them. If I say them out loud, I'll have to do them, right?
Well, how about the ones that you've contracted to do?
No, I don't have any contracts out at this point. I mentioned the one on No Man Knows My History. Didn't I? Yeah, I did. Okay. So I'm interested in that book because it's an interesting. It hasn't been out of print since it was published in 1945, and yet American printing technology has shifted over the years. And so I've gone back, because I'm a geek and I do weird things. I've gone back and broken those books apart to try and explain how they are built and why they are built in the way they're built. Oh, by the way, I found once Fawn Brodie finished with that book, she kind of purged herself of her Mormon content. And most of that is long gone, except I found out that the Dale Morgan papers of the Bancroft have all of the negatives and the prints that she used for that particular title. So that's the only part of her manuscript that survived. So I'm gonna do that at some point. The one that I'm working on right now, that I say I'm working on right now, is a civil rights book about a small county in West Tennessee that I did work on in my doctoral dissertation. And I'm going to talk about the challenge and the intersection between inclusive liberalism and exclusive liberalism in the Constitution, and why voting rights took the route that they took in the 1960s. And I've got to hurry with that because almost all the people who were there are pretty much gone by now. But that's the next big project that I've got to work on. The other one that is almost finished is what began the Morgan's material is all filed alphabetically by incoming or outgoing correspondent, and then it's divided into major and minor people. So you've got a difficult way to follow anything through things. So I've spent, part of the reason this darn biography took so long is I spent 30 some odd years putting all of that back into chronological order. So that will eventually get released in about 8 volumes of the entire Morgan papers, abstracted, not indexed, but abstracted. And then I have another 3 volumes that go, part of that 8 volumes, that produces everything chronologically. So if you want to see how Latter-day Saint studies unfold over time during mid-century America, this is it. But it's going to be about this big.
So Richard, given that you know the full, you've read every document from Dale Morgan, right? Every letter.
Everything.
And given that Morgan occupied a central position within this larger ecosystem of incredible mid-century historians, and given that he was he had such a range of topics that he was working on, what areas of interest, of investigation would you recommend? Like, if you said here are a couple of areas that PhD students should tackle as part of their project, or
Oh, you mean currently?
currently, like what remains to be, like what could someone mine from this collection, or what topics could
I
might be
really, that's a good one. I would love to be the one, and I'm never going to be able to do it. Somebody needs to go do a historiology of mid-century Latter-day Saints. Okay, now historiology is the way that history is viewed and what it can do, not the way it's written, But what does a culture think that history can do? How does it justify its own story from the past? Right? It's a very narrow branch of historical inquiry, but it is absolutely fascinating. I was introduced into my graduate program, and that's one of the things that shaped this book, because I realized that history isn't the same from generation to generation, and we all knew that. But there was a major shift between, say, 1940 and 1990 in what we as a culture thought that history could do, just the way it could be regarded. How does it deal with evidence? What does that say about truth with a capital T? How do facts work in? What happens when you have conflicting interpretations of the same things? What happens when you have conflicting documentation of an event? You know, how do you manage that? I think that needs to be done at some point. I don't know that I'm going to do it. It'll take an intellectual historian with real chops to do after that. But I think that's one. I think it'd be a fascinating study to look at the way that storytelling changed between, say, 1925 and 1975, about that 50-year period, because it really is different. When you look at the number of books, there's an explosion at certain points in time that are largely technological. Okay, so the move in the early 1980s from letterpress to photolithography, photo offset, that makes it possible to push books out far quicker. The move to desktop publishing in the 90s, I lived through that one. In fact, in my little company, I burnt the last fold and trim blues that our company did, and then we got rid of our equipment entirely and moved to DTP. We went direct disc to plate. I think there's all kinds of room in actual real-life book history. Nobody's tackled that other than me. I mean, I did that 1920 book. And I think that's an absolutely untouched facet of Latter-day Saint history. Problem is, I don't know if anybody's going to read it. That's the problem. You know, there's a few purists out there, but I think there's intersections and you know, intersectionality is a big term these days in some aspects of history and sociology. But there's lots and lots and lots of intersections. The idea between the Wasatch Front Mormonism and rural Mormonism, what that looked like and how it functioned. The idea of post-war mobility among Latter-day Saints. Nobody has touched that. That's never been looked at. The rise of credentialism in both federal service and government service from top to bottom has never been looked at adequately. Just in the Morgan papers, I think a shift in part of the problem is the Morgan papers are incomplete. We've got probably 2/3 to 3/4 of what he actually wrote, and there's all kinds of tantalizing clues of things that he was just too disorganized to file himself. That you're just going to have to throw up your hands and just say, "What?" When I did my calendar to the Morgan papers, I added another 1,500 items, and there are probably even more than that. I probably will add 2,000 items. That just scratches the surface, and that's just the stuff that I found that he wrote that we didn't know about. There were all kinds of people he just never bothered to keep their letters with. I think there needs to be a really good study on the lost generation writers, both the fiction writers, which somebody's actually kind of done a beginning on that one, but Gary Topping's book begins the process, but we really need to tie into that and then see the shift between that generation of writers and the academics of Leonard Darrington's generation. So that would be the ones off the top of my head, just out of the Morgan papers and related to it, that would make sense for me. What else? That pretty much it?
Guess so. We're good time to wrap up, I think.
Fair enough.
Well, thank you very much for